was born in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and came here in 1923. I lived on the east side, Lower East Side, which is known as Black Bottom.
Black Bottom, that Lower East Side section of the city, just outside of downtown Detroit, gets that name from the rich soil that the Lower East Side certainly has. Some of us believe that the French settlers began to call that section of the city Black Bottom. It was one of the older sections of the city. It's one of the first set of neighborhoods in Detroit. People lived day to day in Black Bottom. Certainly in the 20s and 30s, it was a largely immigrant community, and then African Americans coming from the South. And many of those people worked in the automobile industry or were either business owners. And so for the most part, their existence was pretty comfortable.
I went to school near Black Bottom. It was on Hastings, like, and Chain. And what I remember is it was all black people. And there were black restaurants, there were black clubs, because I saw Aretha Franklin down there.
I used to live in the Brewster Projects as a young boy in the 1950s. And for those people who don't know, I mean, that was this huge complex that Joe Louis, Dinah Ross, Smokey Robinson, all of us at some point lived there. In addition to that, on Hastings Street, which was the center of culture for so much of Black Bottom, and it was like every day the streets were packed. There were all these stores, and in fact, when I was 11 years old, I went to work at a barbershop, Reverend Murray's barbershop, and I swept the floors. And I think I made $5 a week. I mean, I was in heaven thinking about that, at 10 or 11 years of age doing that. But seeing all the people on Hastings Street, it was so vibrant that the location was, and to see all the people all have a good time.
Urban League points out in 1917 that about 1,000 blacks are moving to Detroit each month. And they're doing so and as part of what we come to know as the Great Migration. They're doing so to take advantage of, for the most part, better jobs, better homes, better economic and social opportunities. By the 1940s, Black Bottom becomes majority African American and majority poor. Middle-class African Americans were able to move to other sections of the city, like the Old West Side, or the Conant Gardens section, and so you saw sort of a middle-class flight. Between 1910 and 1930, the African American population in Detroit skyrockets. From about 5,700 African Americans in 1910 to about 120,000 African Americans by 1930. At one time, Detroit was the fourth largest city in America. Coleman Young moves to Detroit from Tuscaloosa, Alabama with his family in 1923. His family sets up shop in the Black Bottom community. Coleman Young writes in his 1994 memoir, Hard Stuff. He writes, when he thinks about 1923, the Black Bottom community looked like a United Nations. It was European immigrants, African Americans who were moving to Detroit, many of them from the South. Coleman says, our house was next door to an Italian family. There was a Syrian family that lived down the street from Coleman Young. A German grocer at the intersection where he lived. I can still smell the sourdough bread and the Jewish delicatessen that was around the corner. By 1930, the Detroit Urban League points out that there were about 350 African American businesses just in that Black Bottom and Paradise Valley section of the city. Whites were concerned about whether or not they were going to lose jobs because Detroit's black population doubles from about 149,000 people in 1940 to about 300,000 people in 1950. The riot speaks to that. It really becomes the concern of not all whites, obviously, but certainly enough to create a race riot. As early as the 1940s, Edward Jeffries Jr. is the mayor of Detroit. He has presented an opportunity, today we call it urban renewal, they call it slum clearance, to eliminate older sections of the city and produce new housing. And so Black Bottom falls into that sweet spot. In 1948, a young 15-year-old named Leon Mosley, an African American, is fatally shot by 2 white police officers. He's fatally shot, y'all, because according to the police, he stole a car in the Black Bottom area. And what we call today, the phrase, he was joyriding. When police approached him, he began to move away from the police. Mosley is running away from the 2 white police officers in 1948. But they shoot him anyway. The black community pushes back and holds a series of protests. A couple of people who are in that rally, actually organized that rally, are Coleman A. Young and George Crockett Jr. They lead the charge against this egregious fatal shooting by the white police officers. But as a familiar story goes in America, the white cops get off. They essentially escape. And the Mosley killing really is one of the first in a long line of unfortunate incidents between a largely white police force and a largely African American community.
At a young age, 14, we would see all these police officers, and all the police officers were white. I saw 2 black police officers in all the time that I lived there. And the bad thing was that you would see these police officers, they would stop these young black boys, men on the street, and it was brutal what they would do. I was saying, man, this is never going to happen to me, because I'm a young kid and I'm okay. And my mother would always say, son, listen, you stay away from the police, And I thought I was. But at the age of 14, I was grabbed and beaten up by the police. I became one of those victims. And before that time, I had no thoughts of what I wanted to do when I grew up. No thoughts whatsoever. But when I was beaten up by the police, and this one brutal cop, his name was Rotation Slim, and everybody in the Brewster Projects knew Rotation Slim. He was this tall guy who just beat people up. But they beat me up that day, September of 1957. And I remember going home and not saying anything to my parents, because back in those days, if a black person or any person who was a minority went to the police station and made a complaint, chances are they would get beaten up also. So I made myself a promise that evening. I was going to become a police officer. So in 1965, I joined the Detroit Police Department. I never knew that I would become chief of police.
Coleman Young, he enters the Army in 1943. But while he's there, he and others banded together to push back against race discrimination being carried out in the U.S. Army. There was an officers club at that Indiana base that did not have any black members. And so the day that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the great American president, dies, Coleman Young is being held in confinement because of the pushback that he and others carried out. I'm going to talk specifically about a man named Eugene Greenhut. He's a New York developer. He comes to Mayor Jeffries with a plan as early as 1944 and says, Mr. Mayor, I understand that you have some sections of your city that have older housing, and you certainly would understand, Mr. Mayor, that if those communities, those older communities are redeveloped, it might help keep people in the city. It might attract more people to the city. It's a stronger city with stronger housing. The idea resonates with Mayor Jeffries, and he listens to the idea, but he puts it on the back burner. And part of the reason is when white folk heard about their neighborhood possibly being condemned, seized, they lost their minds. And so in 1946, Mayor Jeffries writes his council and says, I have an idea that I'd like for you to support. It is, in effect, raising through government authority the Black Bottom neighborhood to create a residential neighborhood. And that redevelopment project is the community that we know today as Lafayette Park. Communities that are seized by government where poor black people are displaced for middle-class white people. That's what happened. That's what happened in Black Bottom.
Unfortunately, what happened in Detroit in that urban renewal is a pattern that has occurred all over this country.
The story of Black Bottom is really a story of so many American cities, right? San Francisco, LA, all of these different urban places where there was once a thriving Black neighborhood and commercial center, and then that was displaced, right, for the greater good. But the stories of the actual inhabitants of those neighborhoods, their rich history and all of that was lost, is not told.
I think it's really easy to look at our sort of current city and not know that these things that we sort of take for granted, like, oh, this nice new stadium, has sort of come at a cost of destroying lives of many generations. I think it's really easy to sort of not just drive on the freeway and not notice that and not know that history.
Mayor Coble did not announce the route for the Chrysler Freeway until 1954. By then, most of Black Bottom was gone. They called it Tumbleweed City. One of the saddest stories about condemnation and eminent domain, government terms that basically say that government can seize land even if it's privately owned, if it is for the greater good, was this 1966 Detroit Free Press story about a woman named Sadie Bell Davis. Sadie Bell Davis was a 75-year-old in 1966, got a knock on the door by the government and they said, "We're seizing your home." Now, Sadie owned her home, modest home on Maple Street in Black Bottom, condemned by the city in 1951. The city offered her $2,500. This is a 75-year-old woman. Her husband has died, and city says, we don't really care whether you own your house or not. We don't really care that these are your golden years. You're gonna have to find some other place to stay. The city of Detroit did not do what cities do today and have processes in place to find new homes for people. They didn't do that.
You know what I find sad is that they didn't take into consideration the people that were living there. There were people. They didn't take into consideration they were taking away people's homes. You know, it's like, all right, if you're gonna take my house, you gotta help me find another place to live, or it's just, they didn't look at the whole picture.
The I-375 opened in 1964, so other Black communities outside of the traditional Black Bottom community are forced to move too because of urban renewal. Elmwood Park is almost in some ways like the government's makeup call. Government said, okay, we recognize that we made a mistake, so next time is going to be different. Through a few different mayors, there's a conscientious attempt to create more market share housing and housing for seniors, and that begins in the 1960s. Coleman was elected in 1973. One of the things he says he's going to do, I'm going to create housing opportunities for people who lost them in the late 1940s and early 1950s. He sees it as his responsibility to help remake the Lower East Side, the same community that he came to 50 years before. So he built senior housing, particularly along Shane. The Prince Hall apartment project comes online in 1989. It is designed for working class families, to be sure, still sits there today. After Coleman Young leaves office in 1993, Mayor Archer continues that effort. There is a dedication for the Ida Young apartments. The Detroit Free Press named Coleman A. Young one of Detroit's best mayors of all time. When I had the opportunity to lead presentations and speak on panels, I think the two things that I go into those situations hoping to come away with. One, as I always say at the Open, I don't know everything. And I learned something new from the people who have come to see it. And so there's not a time that goes by that I don't learn something. The other takeaway that I like to have happen is I want to bottle it and I want to move it across the city and move it across the state. I'm now working with local school districts and working with government to infuse more of this local history into lesson plans for school-age children. I am dedicated to chronicling and sharing African American life in Detroit, and I've done that, been fortunate enough to do that in a lot of spaces. I am certainly proud of the partnership with the Detroit Public Library. It is a great resource for all Detroiters in a space that I recommend to all.